Guys, my first Bitcoin was a physical Bitcoin, and it was one of the Casascius Bitcoins. Casascius is one of the first company to make physical representations of Bitcoins. It's basically a token that has some pretty graphics. It's gold colored, and on the back there's a private key or a code, I guess, that goes to Mt. Gox that you can put in and redeem your Bitcoins, and is covered up by a hologram for security. It's basically a way to have physically represented Bitcoins. And so I have kind of a soft spot in my heart for those, I guess, because that was the first coin that I ever possessed or received. Now there's more physical Bitcoins starting to come out. People have made coins that are actually made out of silver or even gold that have Bitcoin private keys on them, and they're somehow encoded for security so that someone can't just like look at the private key on the back and take the Bitcoins and run. And now there are even physical Litecoins coming out. There are some silver pieces that somebody has made, and they're, very beautiful graphics and have a Litecoin private key on the back. What's your opinion about physically represented coins? Because I could see how that might be a little confusing to a newbie. Like, you tell them, wow, there's this great virtual currency and it's all online, it's frictionless, you can send it anywhere in the world, and oh, by the way, here's this chunk of metal that you can use to represent it.
It's a little confusing.
I could see how that would be kind of confusing. But on the other hand, I could see how it might also help somebody grasp the concept, right? Or help somebody feel more comfortable using it because it's something they can actually hold in their hand. Other talk around physical Bitcoins or other coins has centered around, is this a good way to do cold storage? Is this a good way to secure your coins offline? And is this a good way to use them anonymously? What do you guys think about that?
When I first got into Bitcoin, physical Bitcoins were absolutely the first thing that caught my attention, and the Casascius coin was definitely up there. There was also BitBills that I was interested in. Let's explain real briefly how these things work, because it is a confusing concept. And whenever you talk to people, I used to bring physical Bitcoins with me when I'd go someplace because it was an easy way to introduce it. But it also is the wrong way to introduce it because people don't understand the way that they work. What you're essentially doing with either a physical Bitcoin or a paper wallet or really any of these things is you're taking your wallet information, and instead of storing it on your computer, you're storing it on a physical object. And the hope is that it's stored there in a way that is secure so that it can have value loaded onto it through a public key that can then be verified through the public key. But so long as that private key is covered up, then nobody can spend it. So it means that you can easily verify the value within the token. And just by looking at it, you can see that it hasn't been tampered with, which means that it's still up for grabs. Really what this means, though, is that when you give someone a physical Bitcoin in person, you're not doing a Bitcoin transaction as the network usually does. Instead, what you're doing is you're literally giving them a wallet that contains a known amount of Bitcoin. So if you think about it, that's a really interesting thing. And it means that physical Bitcoins are the single most anonymous way to spend Bitcoins of anything, because so long as it's passing from hand to hand to hand, you can see this being used at conferences or something like that. There's no record of any of those transactions, in much the same way that if I hand you $1, there's no record of that transaction. If we were to make the transaction through the Bitcoin network, there would be a record. And so you'd be able to see them, but in a physical form, that's just not the case.
Another way of thinking about this, one of the main differences is the money we've been grown accustomed to over our lives has been physical money that's gradually been abstracted into the digital realm. From gold coins, intrinsic value abstracted, now it's more of an abstraction of the productive capacity of the country per se. But when you're dealing with digital money in our banking system, you're really representing the physical dollars of the treasury and the reserve banking capacity of the banks. Essentially, you're representing physical money in digital form. Bitcoin tokens are the exact opposite. You're taking digital frictionless money and you're representing it in physical form, and that creates some very interesting opportunities. The first one is that you're replacing all of the existing protocols of Bitcoin with physical equivalents. So securing your Bitcoins becomes a physical exercise. Transacting your Bitcoins becomes a physical exercise. You hand them over. Accounting for your Bitcoins is a physical exercise. You count them. You can visibly see how many there are. It really physicalizes not just the value, but all of the interactions, security features, and accounting features of Bitcoin. But it's still digital. So you can do some really interesting things. Like, imagine if let's say you had a physical Bitcoin that had some intelligence in it. You could have it locked to your own private security code based on proximity. So when you hand it to another person, a buyer, maybe your phone hands off the encryption keys to their phone as the physical token changes sides and unlocks it. So you could add extra layers of security or extra layers of intelligence because it is digital money, even though it's encoded in a physical token. So it's both weird, but it's also extremely exciting because it opens up new capabilities for Bitcoin that come from the physical realm, but also new capabilities for physical money that come from the Bitcoin realm, and creates a whole new category of money, which is this tokenized digital currency that we've never had before. And it has its very own characteristics.
You know, it's the local global thing, I think, that's the most interesting about it. You know, you can think about the digital version of Bitcoin as quite literally the global version where you can do business with anybody, anywhere, you know, who's connected to the internet. And then these tokens are the localized format where they create some problems of their own, of course, because it's very hard to take a sealed physical Bitcoin and send it through the internet to someone. But you can make zero confirmation transactions because no transaction is actually happening. The one thing that people do tend to be concerned about with these, and I think that it's with good reason, and I'm not really sure what the solution is to this yet necessarily, is the problem of these are mostly made by individuals, and these are mostly made by very small companies because, again, the infrastructure hasn't really been there to require any sort of larger companies. Mike from Casasius still does all of his own, the sticker application by hand because there's sensitive information there. And if somebody were to get that and use it maliciously, then you could take the value off of it. And this is something that's really only a vulnerability at the beginning of the process when you're actually manufacturing them. But it's something that wouldn't necessarily show up until years, weeks, you know, whatever point later that it makes sense to pull the value off of the coin. Looking at other areas of technology, Andreas, are there any solutions to that type of problem where you've got information that no human can know and yet it has to be applied during the manufacturing process?
That's a great question. Actually, Mike Caldwell himself has already solved this problem. The solution comes with a proposal he calls BIP38, the Bitcoin Improvement Protocol 38, which allows for encryption of private keys. The simplest case, which we've actually implemented in the Safe Paper Wallet and Open Paper Wallet, is where you want on a paper wallet to encrypt a private key or in a Casasius coin with a PIN number or passphrase. So unless you know that second PIN number or passphrase, you can't unlock it. That's number one. What's not obvious from the specification is Mike has also proposed a multi-factor approach to this that involves splitting the private key in such a way that the manufacturer only knows part of the secret and can generate a coin, but that coin is useless unless it's paired with a private component that the buyer knows. And that actually essentially splits the key between manufacturer and buyer and guarantees that initial stage of the process when it's shipped.
That's very clever. That might be a good way to actually use physical Bitcoins for secure cold storage.
Absolutely. And I think BIP38 is going to become a critical component of that. I want to also push back on another concept, which is this idea that if you have a token, a physical token like that, it has to be perfect. It doesn't have to be perfect, and it doesn't have to be perfect to retain its value. And the reason I know this is because a very large percentage of the $20 bills that go through my hands are forged and counterfeit. And that applies also to a large percentage of the $20 bills that go through your hands. Yet we don't notice, and we also don't freak out about the value of our $20 bills, because if you have a system of enforcement where, you know, every 100 transactions, that dollar bill goes through a merchant or retailer or banking teller who's going to use a magic pen to test it and take it out of circulation if it's counterfeit, you can make that the part of costs of doing business and essentially discounting the value by the amount of fraud that exists, which means you don't need 100% security. Sometimes you only need maybe 75% security. It establishes enough trust between consumer or buyer and seller that you don't need to do validity checks at every point. So I don't get a swipe of the UV pen on my $20 bill at every retail merchant. I don't get it at every checkout counter. But it happens often enough that the overall system is trusted. Let's discount this idea that you need 100% security. For physical circulation, you just need enough security that the majority of people can trust it for transactions.
But is that true for people who are looking at it for storage applications? Because I agree with you. it's not unusual for temporary or, event-specific token-based currencies to pop up. I mean, that's something that's happened forever. People don't generally save money in those. People generally use them, and then that's it. They lose their value once that particular event is done, or, they devalue. Something happens. But the point is that with Bitcoins, that's not necessarily true. And ideally, people wouldn't have to be cashing in their physical Bitcoins for the digital Bitcoins because of these concerns about security. And, I've had my coins at this point, I think, for about 2 years. So, isn't that a concern?
Is it a concern as to whether they still retain the value? I believe you could check. Could it?
Right, I could check. That's not what I mean. I mean, you're saying that it doesn't matter to you if a couple of counterfeit 20s go through your hands because chances are pretty good that you're not going to be the one that feels the pinch when eventually they're pulled out of the system. Chances are pretty good. They're not staying in your hands. You're not keeping those counterfeit $20 bills and you're not storing them in a bank where you're going to get those same $20 bills back. They're fungible.
It's a transactional currency. I mean, that's the fundamental difference, which is that if you use the physical Bitcoin tokens as a transactional currency, you don't care about forgery. If you use the physical Bitcoin tokens to store large amounts of Bitcoin in cold storage, I would totally recommend encryption and verifying the amounts are on there after you've encrypted it so that they stay on there. Absolutely. Which is where you'd apply something like BIP38.
Well, that's exciting. I didn't know that Mike was working on that, but that's really cool because that is a problem. I actually worked on a project called Bitcoin chips this was one of my first projects in the Bitcoin space. That was a real problem that we had, was trying to figure out ways where we could be able to manufacture these things without exposing it. So it's great to see that there's been work done on that.
Hi, this is Jason King, founder at Sean's Outpost, and you are listening to Let's Talk Bitcoin. Sean's Outpost is a homeless outreach in Pensacola, Florida, and we are proudly powered by Bitcoin. To date, over 13,000 meals have been fed to the homeless in our area, all purchased with Bitcoin and through the generosity of the cryptocurrency community. Read more about us at seansoutpost.com. Food, shelter, Bitcoin, everybody. Sean'sOutpost.com.